All right, last reading about Beethoven. Many of these details are going to sound super familiar to you, but I love to give it to you from all the different angles and not miss any of these details. So here we go. And this is the reading that has the portrait of him in the upper left-hand corner. It says he was a composer of the classical and romantic eras, and that is accurate. He began taking piano lessons at age 4, and when Ludwig turned 8, his father decided to make money from his son's talent. He presented Ludwig as a concert pianist and advertised that the 8-year-old Ludwig was only 6 years old. Although Ludwig was never a child prodigy like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, by 14, he was quite a good musician and became the assistant organist at a local church. I don't think that's too bad. How many of you are 14 or close to 14? That's kind of impressive. At 17, he met Mozart, who predicted a great career in music for Beethoven. By 19, he was playing violin in local orchestras and giving music lessons to help support his family because his dad was drunk all the time. In his early 20s, he moved to Vienna, Austria, and began composing and performing as a concert pianist. And here, he took composition lessons from Franz Joseph Haydn, and we talked about Haydn earlier too. Beethoven knew that to earn a living as a composer, he needed wealthy patrons who would support him financially. He began making friends with wealthy supporters of music. By 1795, at age 25, he abandoned teaching and began composing and performing full-time. He traveled throughout Europe, displaying his talents as a composer and pianist to larger audiences. His earliest compositions were orchestral and chamber music, primarily sonatas, concertos, and various piano works. He wrote his first symphony in 1800 and shortly after began composing oratorios. The period 1800 to 1815 was prolific for Beethoven. That means he composed a lot. By 1815, age 45, he had completed 8 symphonies, 27 piano sonatas, numerous sonatas for various string instruments, 10 piano trios, 11 string quartets, dozens of orchestral works, and numerous vocal solos and choral works. Composing was difficult for Beethoven. He anguished over every piece. He had begun losing his hearing by his 20s, and by his mid-40s, he gave up his performing career, devoting as much time as possible to composing. The last 12 years of his life were spent composing while he slowly but steadily lost all of his hearing. Beethoven spent his life seeking financial support from wealthy patrons of the arts. He fell in love several times but never married. His poor origins prevented him from marrying the upper-class woman he desired. In practical matters, such as renting an apartment, organizing performances of his music, or publishing his music, he was a disaster. Beethoven was short, stocky, and muscular. He dressed carelessly. He was often restless and moody and worked at composing every morning with intense concentration. He would fly into a rage at small matters which upset him, and yet he was always loyal to his friends and supporters. Those friends and supporters helped give Beethoven the freedom to compose some of the greatest European music of the 19th century. So there's a couple things I'm thinking about before we move on to the factoids and the time frame that he lived in, which will be in the next video. I sort of wonder if there's any way to know what caused him to go deaf. I haven't looked into any of this, but I often have been really curious about it, if they know what was wrong with him that caused him to go deaf, would it be possible to have cured him? And, it makes me wonder if it was something simple that would have been easy to cure. Maybe not. But it seems really unusual that a person goes deaf at that young of an age, unless they had some sort of you hear about people going deaf because they were exposed to super loud sounds, but maybe it was some sort of an illness, or maybe it was something really simple that could have been cured. So that's just really tragic. The other thing I think, and, we read all these 3 readings, and they talk about Beethoven and, how he was moody, and he yelled at people, and he acted crazy. I really think legitimately he was mentally ill. And I don't think it's so nice to talk about a person that way. It makes me a little bit sad that history remembers him this way, almost like a comic sort of way, like making fun of him for being so crazy acting. I don't know. I know of a lot of people these days that if they didn't have a therapist or they weren't on certain medication or working through certain things would probably act crazy too. And yet, because they have the benefits of those things or the benefits of supportive people around them, that they don't act crazy and that people don't make fun of them. So I guess my heart always kind of goes out to Beethoven when I hear these stories about him and the way people kind of treat him. The last thing I want to say about it is one of the most important things is that he marks the transition away from the patronage system. So we've talked for many years, we've talked for many sessions through many of these years of history about how these composers kind of had no choice in their jobs. Like think about Bach, who when he wanted to switch jobs, they like threw him in jail. Or like Haydn, who yeah, he was lucky to have worked for the same prince for most of his life, but he was still just a servant for that prince. Like they didn't think of him as anything special, and you know, he had to compose what they told him to compose. He was basically a musical slave that was treated really well. And think about Mozart, who kind of like went crazy under that system. He did not want to compose what these people wanted him to compose. He did not want to work for the person his dad wanted him to work for. But it was all part of this patronage system. Like the rich people are in charge. The rich people say what happens. And if you want to be a musician and do your music, you have no choice but to work for these people. And Beethoven is the key. He is the one who just broke free of that. He was so brilliant, and his music, even though he was like acted crazy and like did all sorts of like socially unacceptable things, his music was so stunningly beautiful and so different that he broke free of that. And from his point forward, composers were able to just work for themselves. Like they got to write the kind of music they wanted to. They could perform the kind of music they wanted to. Now, granted, it might have been hard because if you worked for a patron, like let's say you worked for a prince and you wrote music that they didn't love or that the audience didn't love, would you be poor then? No, you worked for them. You just composed something else. For people like Beethoven and onward, they are really in the grasp of the audience now. The audience is the one who's paying the bills for them. So if they write something that the audience thinks is junk, then, you know, they're going to go broke and they're probably going to be homeless, or they're not going to be able to eat for a while. They're not going to be able to clothe their children. So with this freedom comes, you know, it's kind of this detachment from the security of having somebody that takes care of you. But it also gets you away from having to do what somebody tells you you have to do. So, all right, in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on in the world at the time of Beethoven's life, along with some details on one of his most famous pieces.